Hi, guys. We're going to start a little bit early because fuck it, why not? Are we good? Okay, so this is how to teach yourself to code. Um, Before we get started, the slides are up at teachyourselfcode.com. So don't worry about getting everything down on notes. And all of the resources that I talk about, all of the sites and all of the different things are also up there. There's a tiny little cheat sheet. So you can really just sit back and take it in. My name is Matan Griffel, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called The Front Labs. And I like to call it a growth hacking agency. It's both technical and marketing, but these days marketing at startups is very technical. And this talk is adapted from a series of blog posts that I did on the General Assembly. What I'm going to cover is three things. First, stop waiting for the perfect technical co-founder and start actually learning how to code, why you should do that, if it's not already obvious. Second, how you go about choosing a programming language based on what you're trying to build. And third is how I taught myself Rails in a month. And so I'll walk you through the path of what I did and teach you guys some of the lessons I wish I knew along the way. But first, before we begin, a little bit about me. I came upon this topic because I had an idea, like a lot of you guys, I imagine, and I was sort of tired of waiting to find someone to help me build that idea. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who told me about, he had been in a similar situation, and I'll talk about him a bit later, but he really just encouraged me to teach myself. And he showed me a few of the resources, and I went to San Francisco for a month, and it was like my Walden, and I separated myself, and I taught myself how to code over the course of that month, and actually by the end of it, could build out my own web app with the features that I wanted to build. And there's a lot that is not very intuitive. I mean, some of this stuff is literally written in code, right? So there's a lot that I wish I knew before I started that I'm hopefully looking back on my experience now can convey to you guys. What I wanted to build, by the way, was a dynamic pricing system so that people could price the products that they were selling online sort of dynamically based on demand. And I was able to finish that. So going right into it, the first part, why you should stop waiting for the perfect technical co-founder and start actually learning how to code. So why learn how to code in the first place, right? A lot of you guys, I imagine, have an idea that you're here with. And if you're expecting to find the perfect technical co-founder, it's just not going to happen. Sorry. I mean, especially if you just want to be giving them equity and you're not compensating them a lot. Think about it. Anyone with any programming talent right now is getting literally dozens of offers from Facebook, Google, dozens of other startups right now. And if they haven't already taken one of those offers, it's probably because they're working on their own project. I mean, demand for developers right now, as I'm sure you guys know, has literally skyrocketed. So, why should a programmer choose your idea over any other idea? And put it another way, I mean, this is what I hear a lot. Why should they give you 50% of a product that won't exist unless they build it, right? I mean, from a programmer's perspective, having someone who's non-technical is sort of a liability, right? Not really a benefit. So if they're the ones that's building the product, they want 100% ownership of it, which is fair. I mean, that's another reason to build your own product, because you end up owning it, right? So a lot of times I hear, well, what if I just pay somebody to build it for me? Three complaints, and three problems here. You will pay too much. You will be unhappy with the process. And you're going to get something back that you didn't want. And why is that? Well, software is notoriously difficult to estimate going in because of questions like this. Should this feature take 15 hours to build, or am I getting ripped off? How do you know, right? Do you know what to ask for? Do you know what you're getting back? How do you actually objectively look at the code and decide what the guy is making for you and whether it's any good? If you're an entrepreneur waiting for someone to execute your idea for you, you're not an entrepreneur. Sorry. Entrepreneurs don't wait for people to come along and execute ideas for them. They make it happen despite being under-equipped. And that leads me to this quote that I really like from Dennis Crowley, which was pre-Dodgeball, which was his company that he built and sold before Foursquare. He went around for 3 or 4 years looking for that magical engineer who would build all the stuff he was thinking about. Sound familiar? So he never met that person, and so instead he taught himself ASP and MS Access, which is horrible, by the way, really bad stuff, out of a book, and he just started hacking stuff together. He admits he's still a really shitty programmer, but he knows enough to hack together a prototype, which is an important point. Learning how to code is not equal to how to be a software engineer, right? And the skills that you need in both are different, and you approach them both differently, right? The point of this talk is to teach you or to help you figure out the way to learn enough to build a prototype of a product, aka a minimum viable product, which you guys have probably heard the term of lately. So what is minimum viable product? So you have your minimum, which are your crappy products that no one wants to use. And then you have viable, which are products built by companies better financed than you, right? And then right in between, that's the sweet spot. That's the good products for startups to build. MVP is basically just quick and dirty. That's one way of looking at it. Here's another definition. It's the product with the fewest number of features that you need to achieve a specific objective, right? That's all you need to build, and then eventually you get someone to take over from there. As a side note, build products that are valuable despite being ugly, because if you want to build a product that's super polished, you probably have version 1000 in your head, you need to build version 0.01 of that, right? And it's probably not going to look very good. In fact, it shouldn't look very good when you first release it, because it probably means you spent too much time focusing on what it looks like. Does anyone recognize that? That's Twitter's first page. I just dug that up, right? Your product should probably look something like that when you first release it. Notice the missing E, rather. Which brings me to the next point, which is eventually you will need to find a lead developer, right? It's not about becoming the lead developer. It's about building a prototype and then finding someone to take over once you're able to bring on a team, raise money, do whatever you need to do. And learning how to code actually helps you find, pitch, and manage those guys. Because you know the talk, right? You know what you're asking people to do. You know what you're asking people to build as opposed to just talking about feature sets, right? You know where to find them. You know how to pitch them, how to excite them. Because developers are excited not always by the idea itself, but a lot of times by the complexities that go into like the technical problem that's going on, right? And so you could sell them on that if you actually know what's happening. And teaching myself to code was sort of an eye-opener for me because every time people would tell me I can't figure out where to find like a technical co-founder, it was so obvious to me because there were all these events that I'll tell you about where you can go and there are literally dozens of them that just nobody knows about, right? I mean, it's pretty easy. And then finally, and I think most importantly, more and more everything that we interact with in the world around us qualifies as technology, right? For example, 83% of people sleep next to their cell phones. 35% use an app before getting out of bed. This is gross. 40% of people use their phones in the bathroom, right? And 50% of Americans prefer communicating digitally, right? This is what internet usage used to look like throughout the day before smartphones, like little chunks of time. Now it looks like this. I mean, because every second you're pulling out your phone, you have an iPad, you're interacting with something that's technological. And here's a little joke I like. There are 10 kinds of people in the world. Those who understand binary and those who don't, right? But if you didn't get that, you don't understand binary. But seriously, society is actually quickly dividing into two groups of people. The first is those that know how to code, and they can manipulate the very structure of the world around them because more of it's technology than ever before. And those that don't. And their lives are actually being designed and directed by those that do, right? If you want to read more about that, there's a great book called Program or Be Programmed by a brilliant guy named Doug Rushkoff, who I'm a big fan of. But I think that's as significant of a reason as any to actually learn code and learn the underlying structure and language of all these tools that you're interacting with on a daily basis. So moving on, part 2, actually choosing a programming language to start with. I get it, right? It's scary to jump in. And there was a while where I didn't know where to go. I kept thinking, all right, I'm going to do this, but you keep hearing about C and Java and C++ and PHP, and where the hell do you start, right? And there's, at the same time, this fear that if you start with one of these, you'll end up starting in the wrong place, right? I mean, I know that's a big reason why I never actually got started for a while. The truth of the matter is that you can do almost the exact same thing with all these languages, and there are pros and cons to both, but it doesn't matter for you. Like at the end of the day, you don't realize those pros and cons until much later, and it's pretty insignificant. But to get a little bit of a better understanding, let's break down a web application a little bit. So web applications are the applications that are accessed over the internet. Most of the things you interact with on the internet, like Facebook and Twitter, these are web applications. They're like cloud-based versions of applications on your computer. The front end of the web application, you guys are probably a little bit familiar with these languages, the languages here are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And this is the web pages that you are actually seeing. Web application pages are mostly generated dynamically. Right, as opposed to in a static web environment, people are actually hand coding a page for you, like imagine the New York Times. Now there are thousands of pages being served up at any given second, and so everything on this page is dynamic and has to be changing. And so what's happening behind the scenes is the back end, and that's what you don't see. So you have your web pages, which are generated based on information in your database. The database stores all of the stuff, all the information relating to your app. You have your users, you have all of your users' information, and the database languages are primarily SQL. That's sort of the language for structuring that information. And then you have the system of rules, which are taking things from the database and creating web pages out of it and understanding the actual user actions, like when the user clicks the home button, what are they going to see there? Those rules are coded in programming languages like PHP, Ruby, Java, Python, C++, all these other languages, these mystical things that you've heard of but don't know what they do. So that's the back end, and that's what you probably need to know. I mean, so a lot of people start with Codecademy, for example, and Codecademy is JavaScript, but that's all front-end stuff, so you're not going to be building out your application in JavaScript. You can do it, but it's way too roundabout. And then there are web application frameworks. Web application frameworks sort of encompass all of this stuff. These have been developed over the last few years, and they really help you build your app very fast. And these are, for example, Ruby on Rails, Django, which is a framework for Python. Ruby on Rails is for Ruby, and then Zend is a framework for PHP. So what is a web application framework? Well, alleviates overhead associated with web development, libraries, blah, blah, blah. It helps you build web apps really fast, is what you need to know at the end of the day. If your goal is to build a prototype, start with Ruby on Rails. Or Rails. There's a few reasons for this. Ruby on Rails is a web application framework for Ruby, which means it's built on top of Ruby. It's the easiest to dive into right now. It's got a ton of resources out there, and the community is literally gigantic. It's bigger than any of the other communities. It hides all the stuff you really don't need to know. Right? Well, what does that mean? It's just, at the end of the day, a series of shortcuts like this. Right? You write Rails new application, and it generates all these files for you automatically. There's a term called automagically, which is, in Rails, it's built so that you don't even need to know necessarily what's going on. It just works. So, for example, you don't need to know a lot of the back-end SQL stuff if you learn Rails. Right? That's all abstracted away. Even a lot of the front-end stuff you can do in Rails. As a result, you can do stuff like this. There's a famous video of the founder of Rails building out a blog system, a blog app, in 15 minutes. Like, super, super fast. There's a temptation for programmers, if you ask any of them, to say start with PHP or Java or something old school like that. They say it because it sort of mirrors the way we learn things in school, and it's how they learned it. Especially if they've been coding for more than like a few years, they must have learned one of these other things. It's wrong, though. I mean, it's a really bad idea. So with all those languages, you spend months learning how to do the very, very basics so you can do stuff like this, like build a yellow square. I'm not kidding. I had a friend who had a Java class, and this was his midterm. So with Rails fast and simple is the name of the game. The friend who convinced me to learn Rails initially, here's how we started. So he was at working at a parking garage with a friend of his one summer, and they had this idea to build a site where people could upload their Four Loko stories, like Four Loko crazy nights, right? And so he thought, all right, fuck it, I'm at a parking garage, what am I going to do this summer? I'll figure out how to code in Rails. And he built this site in, like 2 months. It looks really bad, right? I mean, but all of a sudden, over a matter of weeks, thousands of people are using this site. I mean, it's still being used, and this is about 2 years later. And all he did was threw a few ads up there, and he still gets about a few $100s every month. He hasn't touched this thing in years. But the point here is that the ability to get quick and positive feedback on your projects is really crucial. I mean, if you have to learn 6 months or a year's worth of a language, you probably won't do it. But to be able to build something like that, even if it looks really bad, and to see that people actually appreciate it and are valuing it and are using it is really, really nice. And it's pretty important, I think, in helping make coding become a little bit more mainstream. So finally, part 3, right? How I taught myself to code Rails in a month. I happen to find traditional learning to be extremely tedious. And that's like the note card version where you write something down on a note card and you look at it and you look at it again until you've actually memorized what's on that note card, and then you flip to the next one. It's just so boring, right? And so do you guys. Otherwise, you would have learned to code by now, right? I mean, books suck, right? So what I did was over the last few years, I developed my own method called brute force learning, or that I call brute force learning. It comes from college. I guess I stumbled upon this. I used to download classes, the podcasts of classes I was taking at school. I went to NYU. And so I studied finance and philosophy. And so if I was taking Intro to Ancient Philosophy at school, I would download the Intro to Ancient Philosophy podcast at Berkeley. And I would just basically listen to it while I was on the subway or walking around the city, very passively taking this stuff in. But what happened was it ended up eliminating hundreds of hours of studying I would have had to do otherwise, more active learning stuff. And the teachers love like the unique perspectives that you can bring in, right? That they didn't cover in class, but are like really smart insights. But so why does this work? Well, have you ever been confused by something when it's explained one way, but then when it's explained a different way, it just sort of clicks, right? Or put it a different way, if you were in a room full of smart people, would you ask the same person to explain the same thing over and over again, or would you ask a lot of the people? By the way, do you see what I did there? The end result is that learning is less tedious. And I think more importantly, the stress of feeling like you have to learn something the first time actually disappears. And that helps you learn it faster. It's really okay to not understand something the first time, right? Isn't that actually sort of the point, right? There's no way that you can know it the first time you learn it. So the way I look at it is that the first time you learn something, your mind is creating sort of a mental map, like a fuzzy map of what's going on, and you don't exactly remember the little pieces, but you sort of remember how it all works. And then you go, I don't know why that happened. It's restarting. Sorry, guys. Yes, save 2 minutes. Right. So then when you go back, you really learn their specifics, and it actually starts to make a little bit more sense. You have these concepts to sort of, they're hooks, and then you can hang more ideas on that. So what I did and what I recommend that you guys to do is just speed through as many introductory tutorials as you can, and there are a lot out there. Rails has literally dozens of these. So here's the path that I took. I like lynda.com, and they have video tutorials of a lot of these different, like Photoshop or languages or things like that. I did the Ruby on Rails 3 Essential Training by Kevin Skoglund, and I did that in a week. And so technically you have to pay for Lynda, but they give you a 7-day free trial, which is just enough time to learn this thing and then bail, which worked well for me. It's 12 hours of material, and you can really just power through it. I mean, that's what I did. Watching videos is so much better than reading this stuff. And if you just copy what the guy is doing, and then you may run into a few bumps every once in a while, figure that out, you can power through this stuff really fast. And you're not going to know how to build a web app after this thing. That's not really the point, right? But you're going to have a pretty good understanding of what goes into it, and you'll remember, deployment, and you'll remember what the web app framework is, so that the next time you see the concepts, it actually starts to make more sense. So after that week, what I did was I went through the Ruby on Rails tutorial by Michael Hartle, and it took about 2 weeks because it's kind of dense stuff. The book for this is available for free online. So just search Rails tutorial, and the whole thing is online for free. He has screencasts, like also videos that you can pay $95 for. And I haven't taken them, but I've heard they're really good. And this is basically this one is longer, but it's sort of one of the best resources out there right now for learning Rails. But really the benefit with starting with the videos is that by the time you get to this one, it's all really familiar, and you remember most of it. And then the second time you're like, oh yeah, okay, I get this. By the time you're done with this, you can build a basic web app, and you end up building one that looks like Twitter, which I think there's a slide of later. But then what I did was I did this web applications class by a guy named John Ousterhout. He's a really awesome guy at Stanford University. And Stanford podcasts most of their classes online. If you, I guess for some reason, want to build an iOS app, for example, they have a whole iOS class for free online with one of the best professors out there. A lot of times people tell me that they want to build a mobile app, and I really have to ask them why they want to build a mobile app, because most of the time the product you want to build, it doesn't have to be a native app. You could build a web app for that. So that actually avoids the whole Apple App Store process and having to learn Objective-C, which is actually, as of recently, the only way you can code iOS apps. Now you can do it using Ruby, because someone released something called Ruby Motion. And so actually learning Ruby on Rails is going to sort of help you along in that process too. But this is a really great class because he covers a lot of the more computer science-y aspects of the theory behind what's going on. And so by the time you have actually gotten through the first two, this makes a lot more sense. And it's pretty interesting because you get a sense of where Rails fits into the overall landscape. So at this point, you can build your own basic web app. Right? This is actually what you're going to have at the end of the second tutorial. Does this look familiar to anyone? Right. It's basically Twitter. And it looks better, I think, than the first version of Twitter, which we saw. But there are going to be specific features still that you don't know how to implement. Rails Casts is a really, really great resource for that specifically. He uploads videos, 7 to 10 minute long videos about how you implement really specific features from, your user login system or Stripe payment processing or the KISS metrics or whatever. So probably anything you could want to build, he has a video for already. And it's really great stuff. At some point along the way, you may feel the temptation to stop and learn Ruby or HTML or CSS. I've heard people tell me this all the time. Don't do that. It's so roundabout. I know a guy who started with these tutorials, and then he said, well, I felt like I didn't really have an understanding of Ruby, and so I did this Ruby course, and it took him 6 months, and he now understands Ruby better, but now he has to start at the exact same place, and now he's 6 months behind, right? Ruby is really huge. Right? That's Ruby, and that's Rails, and you only need to know a really small amount of it. Right? And the same is true for HTML and CSS and JavaScript. You end up learning that stuff along the way. So it's okay if you don't know it, because most of the good introductory tutorials it's included because Rails is an application framework, so you have to learn how to do the front end stuff and a little bit of the back end stuff. So don't go out of your way to try to learn that stuff. But after you've finished, if you're interested, you can check out some of the more fun basic resources that teach you basic Ruby, like Ruby Monk or Ruby Warrior or Ruby Cones, Learn Ruby the Hard Way. These are basically like Codecademy, but for Ruby. And they're fun. You're not going to learn how to build a web app because it's two totally different skill sets, but you'll learn about strings and arrays and variables and constants and things like that may be useful. For troubleshooting along the way, right? It's literally, even from installation of Ruby, it sucks. Installing Rails really sucks. So don't give up at that point. It could take you a day. It could take you 2 days. Email me if you have a question. My email's at the end here. But don't give up at that point because that'd be really sad. But you're going to run into a few bumps because for some reason, every computer is different. So you may have problems at a step where I didn't, and so I'll see an error and it'll go just smoothly for you, right? You'll read in the tutorial, then you do this and it'll be fine, but your computer is like, no. So what do? Most of the time, you can literally just copy a bit of the error and paste it into Google, and you will see the answer. I mean, it's like your world's answers for everything. Someone has bumped into this problem before, and just copying a bit of the code and pasting it into Google will find you your answer. A lot of times, you'll end up on a site called Stack Overflow, which is it's a bit like Reddit, but for computer science Q&As, and people will post this question that they have, here's an error, or here's something I want to do, how do I do it? And then there are lots of answers, and then one gets upvoted the most, and that becomes the verified answer. So you'll know that's one of the advantages of using Rails, which is that it's such a big community that most likely any problem someone's already encountered before, right? Whereas in some of the other languages, that may not be the case. A lot of times you know what feature you want to build, but you don't know what it's called. I studied philosophy, and this is actually called Meno's paradox, right? How the hell do you know how to look for something if you don't know what it is? For example, a cron job lets you schedule tasks in an app. How would you know it's called a cron job, right? I mean, you end up searching the web for hours before you figure that out. Ask someone. It's the easiest way to do this, and you guys, I think, are all based in New York City, and so you have a ton of resources, trouble, at your disposal, right? Rails happens to be very, very popular right now, and there's a very big community for support. And the best way to learn is to go to a Rails meetup and ask someone who knows more than you. So here are a few meetups that I learned about along the way. There's nyc.rb, there's NYC on Rails, New York Ruby Meetup, Ruby Newbie. There are tons out there, right? And there are meetups for any other thing that you could want to learn. You can write that down, but it's all online too, by the way, at teachyourselfcode.com. And then I really suggest you go attend some hackathons and find teams to work with, because there's no better way to really cement the knowledge that you've learned than actually putting it into practice. I think the whole reason that hackathons even exist nowadays is because of web app frameworks like Rails and Django. They let you build an application so fast because there are so many shortcuts that you can, right, over the course of 3 days, build a fully functioning thing, which is not something that was possible before using some of the old school languages. So to hear about hackathons, sign up for the following mailing lists. There are tons of General Assembly, which is where I teach out of, and they do hackathons probably every other weekend. This Week in New York City Innovation, it's a great newsletter list by Charlie O'Donnell, Startup Digest, Startup Weekend. These are all different organizations that do hackathons. And there's also an unlimited list of resources I can't attest to, but that I've heard are really good, right? So things are really falling apart. There's Rails for Zombies, which I've heard great things about. Peep Code, Railscast is great. Agile Web Development with Rails, Ruby on Rails guides, Hackety Hack, Team Treehouse, Codecademy, Code School. I'm literally hearing about a new thing every day. And so, go try some of them out. I can't say that the way I learned it is how you should be doing it. But I do think it makes a lot of sense to go through a lot of these things very fast. And so I wanted to end, before I open it up to Q&A, on the story of Startup Weekend, which was the first hackathon that I went to after teaching myself to code. Because I think it's interesting, and it should alleviate some of the concerns you guys have. So I went to the Startup Weekend hackathon, and this was right after I had finished this month, and I had built out my own web application, but I wasn't really very sure that I knew how to code very well, right? Or that I would be really valuable as part of a team. But I figured I would go for it. And the way that it works is people pitch ideas, and then you separate into teams, and then you code on that idea for 2 days. And then you present the idea at the end of those 2 days to a panel of judges, and one of the team wins, or they give out various awards. So I ended up as part of a really big team. It was 10 people, and most of them were really, really experienced coders. They were working at the Department of Defense and Pentagon stuff and, I don't know, top secret databases or whatever. And so I thought, all right, I'm not going to be super valuable here, right? Me and my like Rails skills. They also decided, by the way, to code it in the language called Cold Fusion, which is like very old school. And so I didn't know Cold Fusion, and I just sort of sat back and I thought, well, it'll be an experience to just watch and see how they end up building this, and to really watch, a team of people who have been doing this for a while. I thought I would learn something. And so we spent a long time building out the database, like actually drawing it out on a whiteboard. These are the inputs, and this is how we build it properly with all the relationships so that it can really scale, right? We don't want to have any of the problems of like a non-scaling app. And so time went on, and I started to realize like we're spending a lot of time on this database stuff and on the really fundamental stuff of how this app is functioning. And over the course, like there were technical problems along the way, and they couldn't figure out how to set stuff up and connecting the database with the system to the front end and all these separate moving pieces. And because I didn't know I wasn't coding there, I volunteered to present. And so it was Sunday night approaching the time where we had to present. What did we have? We had the front page. It was by the way, it was like a digital Gallup polling system. So not a very complicated app at all. It was literally a system where you went there and it was like, click here to answer some questions to, so your voice can be heard. Things like New York City related, like, do you think the MTA should be increasing the cost of subway cards? No, probably not. So basically just a polling system, right? So as Sunday 6 p.m. approaches, it's dawning on me that we don't have anything ready. We had the front page, which was an image, right, that someone had put up there, and then we coded a little button on top of it. And I'm up there presenting it, and I click the button to show them what it looks like, and it breaks, right? 3 days and 10 developers, and we can't build something that goes past the first page, right? Which is extremely frustrating for me. We built this database that I'm sure could have scaled to 10 billion people, right? Like Facebook would have been fine on this database, but it didn't work, right? 3 days later, and that was frustrating for me because of the realization, only in hindsight, that I had actually, after learning Rails for a month, had the skills that I needed to build out this thing probably on my own, definitely with a team of 2 to 3 other Rails developers, and we would have had something to show for it, and it would have been fully functioning. Whereas these guys who had been doing this their whole lifetimes couldn't actually build anything beyond that first page, right? And it's sort of the light bulb went off when I realized that things are really changing, right? It's no longer all that valuable to have coded for 10 plus years because the new languages and the new frameworks and the new systems that some of the old school guys are a little bit reluctant to learn are so much faster. They're just leaps and bounds above what have existed for so long that you can learn this stuff that fast, and you can actually build something and be valuable that fast. And I guarantee you that if you take an extra month on this stuff, if you're learning Rails for maybe 2 months or 3 months, you can go join a startup and you can be a valuable part of that startup and you can actually contribute. People ask me that all the time, and I say, if you've gone through these 3 classes, there's something valuable there, right? So that's what I want to end that on, and I want to say thank you guys for being an awesome audience. That's a picture of me. That's my name. That's my email. So feel free to shoot me an email with any questions. That's my Twitter handle, and I'd love to open it up for Q&A or questions if you guys have any. Yeah. I guess I have to pass this around, which will be fun. Maybe you guys want to come to like the front if you have questions.
I want to kind of produce like the next generation of like a search engine. Would I use Ruby or use one of like the old school like?
Yes. So you can build just about anything in any language. It's really not like you can only do stuff in one language, right? Like if you're building a search thing, it's best to do one kind of thing. You can build just about anything in any language. So don't be like afraid that if you're learning Rails, you're not going to be able to do something. That being said, I think the only exception there was mobile up until recently. Like Android is all Java for mobile apps, and iOS has been all Objective-C and JavaScript, and now Ruby. but don't try building a mobile app initially. It's just really hard. Yeah. I'll repeat the question so that people can hear it. So any of this stuff, any languages are fine. You don't need to use PHP, Java, C++. You can do everything in Ruby, which is like the underlying basics of Ruby on Rails, that you can do in PHP and Java. There are different protocols that you have to use to do chat, but that applies to any language you're learning, right? Yeah.
Any recommendations for Windows developers on Ruby on Rails?
As far as like So, I mean, so I did this whole thing on my Mac, so I don't have firsthand experience coding in Rails. That being said, it's actually easier to install Rails on a Windows machine than on a Mac, surprisingly, because there's a website. If you go to the Rails tutorial, there's a whole, one of the first sections is how you install Rails, and I really recommend reading that, because there's like, if you have a Windows machine, just go to this site and download this thing and double click it and it's all there. If you have Macintosh, there are like a few different steps that you have to take. That being said, you know, I haven't encountered, or I haven't heard anyone that had like particular difficulties with one versus the other, if that helps. Yeah? I'll start here. Is Codecademy a waste of time? If you want to build your own web app, it is a waste of time. Like, if you are, I think Codecademy is great for the JavaScript stuff, which is, by the way, all like the little flair. It's the polish on top of your web application that helps you build stuff that moves and that sort of thing, which is totally unnecessary to building a web app. Like, you probably don't need it at all. So if you want to build an app, it's a waste of time. If you want to get proficiency in JavaScript, or if you're doing just the front-end stuff, like if you're a designer, for example, and you want to learn a little bit about coding, but not build out your own web apps, if you want to just do like the web pages itself, then Codecademy is fine. That being said, Codecademy started with JavaScript because it's like one of the easier things to teach in the format that they built out, but they're actually moving into now Ruby and Python and Rails and that sort of thing. So I think very soon they'll have these resources for learning Rails. I don't think they have it right now. So yeah, and I know the founders and they're great guys, and I think it's a great startup, but it's not what you're looking for. Oh, yeah. Okay, so what are some examples of websites created on Rails? Twitter was built on Rails initially. There were a lot. And there are thousands out there. I can't, none off the top of my head. Oh, Dropbox too, I think. Or like the 37 Signals guys actually developed Rails because they used it within their application. It's a lot of hackathon startups that you see are built on Rails. You hear some complaints about scalability, and like if you talk to a developer, they'll say like, "Oh, Rails doesn't scale," like whatever that actually means for you guys. It's very little. I mean, Twitter was able to scale using Rails until they had like probably tens or hundreds of millions of users, and Rails can handle that kind of scale. You know, at that point, you're already like passing it over to someone anyway. Like you're probably going to have to scrap your whole prototype anyway when you hire a team of developers. So don't worry about the scale issues. I know that Twitter happened to just have transitioned over from Rails onto something called Scala, but these companies are dealing with such huge numbers of people, sort of that no other company has ever seen before, like Facebook, for example, and Twitter, that almost no language scales to that point. Like you're probably going to break your app at some point that has nothing to do with the actual programming language you used before you hit the max of the application. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. Yes?
Are you now a full-time web developer?
No, I am not. So I work on a lot of like fun projects on the side, and I talk to developers, and knowing sort of like where they are and who to connect to who has definitely been helpful. A lot of what I do at my company, the growth hacking stuff, is technical. Like there are, how do you build out your app in such a way that it promotes itself, right? And how do you do the A/B testing? and build in the social functionality and sort of reimagining how you design this thing. And I think that marketing is moving in that direction anyway. It used to be a people business, and now it's more of a technical business. But it's the actual skills themselves have been invaluable, right? Because if I have to do something, I can code something together really quickly. I did a mobile website app for a friend of mine recently that he'd been waiting forever to actually build out, and so I just sort of like built it for him really fast. Yeah. Same thing. Software engineers love to call themselves engineers, which I've never gotten because there's also electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, and they just like, no, engineering is like what I do. But it's software engineering, developer, programmer, like technical lead developer. It's all sort of the same thing. Although I'm sure they have preferences as to what you call them. Yeah.
So I know some HTML, CSS, and WordPress. Is Ruby going to be like super? Because I don't know if I understand like the concept. What does it look like? HTML, I know.
Yeah, it looks similar. I mean, at the back end, it's all just text, right? So it's like it's a lot like a language, like a foreign language that you're learning, right? Where you need to understand the verbs and you know the nouns and what you're talking about. And so there is memorization involved essentially. Having knowledge of HTML and CSS, I'd say helps, right? You're not going to feel as confused because you'll understand a lot of the basics of this, but it is a totally different thing at the end of the day. Yeah. Okay. Any questions? One more question.
You talked about if people who use, in order to do a mobile app, you can use Ruby instead of Objective-C.
Yeah.
What's that program like?
Oh, it's called Ruby Motion, and it's very experimental. She's asking about, I said you can use Ruby to code a native like iOS app instead of Objective-C. So this was released a few days ago, but it actually changes everything because there are just not that many Objective-C developers out there, and there are a lot of Ruby developers out there. And up until a few days ago, the Ruby developers couldn't build native iOS apps. So I think it's huge, and you're going to see a lot more mobile apps being built. It's called Ruby Motion, if I haven't said that already. Yeah, it's interesting. It's worth checking out. One of the problems with it is that there are a lot of like plugins that you could put into your app in Ruby and using Rails that exist for web applications. Like you can build in payment processing functionality really easily because someone's already built that for you. That stuff doesn't necessarily exist for mobile yet. So you have to do a lot more stuff from scratch. But Ruby is just so much more easy to learn than Objective-C. Yeah. Any final questions? No? Yes? Yes.
During your months of learning Ruby on Rails, how many hours a day were you actively working on it?
So a little while. Probably during that month, I was actively working for maybe 4 hours a day, right? And so I'm not saying that it's going to take you only a month to go through this stuff, especially if you have if you're working and doing this on the side. It may take you 2 months. It may take you 4 months or 6 months. But the point is, if you have an idea, then not knowing this stuff shouldn't be your barrier, right? That shouldn't be what's stopping you. Because if you have an idea, you could quit your job and you could learn how to code this stuff in under a month and then actually build it, right? So, I mean, it's fairly time intensive and it does take a while. It's not super magical, it's super easy, but you can do it in a matter of a few months now as opposed to 4 years. Okay, good. Thanks. I'll be up here if you have any more questions that are